got a question for you. Where do you turn in times of distress? You know, every person faces distress, trials, and suffering in this life. No one is exempt. Where do you turn in those times? Some turn to friends and family. Some to some professional, perhaps a physician, a therapist, or a lawyer. Others turn to their brothers and sisters in Christ. But some may feel that they have nowhere to turn, that hope and deliverance is far, far away. If I have just described you, I hope you will listen carefully to this message, because I believe you will find hope here. In this message, I'm going to confidently say that in times of distress, we can turn to God. And I want to do so in the context of the fifth sign in the Gospel of John, the time that Jesus walked on water. Here's a preview to this message. First, I want to talk about whether or not we can possibly believe that Jesus actually walked on water. It does seem incredible, doesn't it? And then after we discuss the miracle and the text that tells us about it, I want us to identify what we learn about Jesus from this sign and how that could powerfully apply to our lives. But first, let's read the text. We're looking at John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. And here is John's account of this sign. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. Let's examine this sign. What do you say? The fifth in John's Gospel. This sign, as you may recall, occurred immediately after that of the loaves and fish, or the feeding of the 5,000. After Jesus fed that great crowd with the boys' sack lunch, the people wanted to take him by force, you remember, and make him king. But at that point, Jesus sent the 12 away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he went to the mountain by himself. So picture this. It's evening. Jesus withdraws from feeding the 5,000 to be alone, and he sends his disciples rowing across the Sea of Galilee toward Capernaum. A strong wind arises when they were about 3 miles out into the lake, and things got very rough. Just here I want to rely on information in some of the other Gospels, for this story is recounted in both Matthew 14 and Mark chapter 6. Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus went to the mountain to pray. And Mark informs us that Jesus saw that his disciples were straining at the oars against an adverse wind. Knowing they were fighting the wind and the waves with great difficulty, he decided to leave his place of prayer and go to them. Both Matthew and Mark write that he came to them early in the morning, walking on the sea. John tells us that when Jesus came near the boat, the 12 were terrified. Well, I would have been too. They thought they were seeing a ghost until Jesus identified himself and told them to not be afraid. I'm tempted just here to insert a message on fear, how fear is one of Satan's greatest weapons, and how Jesus helps us to conquer our fears. But since that's not the main message of this lesson, I'll put it aside, try to restrain myself. I do think it is interesting that all the Gospel writers who chronicle this event inform us rather matter-of-factly that Jesus came to the 12 walking on the sea. They describe this event without fanfare, without sensational and expressive adjectives and exclamations. They just give us the facts, ma'am. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Jesus walked on water. Did he really walk on the water? You know, we've noted that Jesus turned water into wine, that he healed a nobleman's son, that he healed a man who couldn't walk, and that he fed 5,000 people. Some of those miracles may have been hard for you to believe, but this miracle may be the last straw for you. You may really find this miracle very hard to believe. How can a person walk on water? Well, do you mind if we talk for just a few minutes about miracles in general? Someone may ask, aren't miracles scientifically impossible? All right, let's think about that. Let's talk a little history, a little science, and a little philosophy, if you don't mind. Scientific mistrust of the Bible began with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas in Europe during the 18th century. Accompanying the Enlightenment was the belief that miracles cannot be reconciled to a modern, rational view of the world. Armed with this presupposition, the presupposition that miracles have no place in modernity, scholars turned to the Bible and said, the biblical accounts can't be reliable because they contain descriptions of miracles. The premise behind such a claim is that science has proven that there is no such thing as miracles. Now, I want to invite you to think hard with me here. Science examines the natural world. Science gathers knowledge about the natural world by observation, the creation of hypotheses to explain certain phenomena, and then experimentation to prove or disprove those hypotheses. As science studies the natural world, it looks for natural causes to explain the natural world. Indeed, it is only equipped to study natural causes. You see, when studying a phenomenon, the scientist must always assume there is a natural cause. That is because natural causes are the only kind its methodology can address. Now, it's one thing to say that science is only equipped to test for natural causes and cannot speak to any others, namely supernatural ones. But it's quite another thing to insist that science proves that no other causes could possibly exist. To say that one can only test natural causes is not to say that no other causes exist. I hope I haven't put you to sleep. Science cannot test for supernatural causes. For example, how would the scientist test for God? He can't touch God, or see God, or observe God with the physical senses. That is, there is no empirical proof for God, no way to test God. But to say that there is no way to test for God, or that there is no empirical proof for God, is not to say that God does not exist. Think about this with me. When one says that science, by its very nature, cannot discern or test for supernatural causes, and then says, therefore, those causes cannot exist, he or she is engaged in fallacious reasoning. Can you see the fallacy behind that reasoning? Just because science cannot discern or test supernatural causes does not mean supernatural causes do not exist. So, let's try to review. The person who says that miracles are scientifically impossible is working under the premise that only natural causes exist. But there is no reason why we must accept that premise. But wait, there's another hidden premise in the statement that miracles cannot happen. It is that there cannot be a God who works miracles. Now think about this with me. If there is a Creator God, if there is a God who is responsible for the creation of the universe, then there is nothing illogical at all about the possibility of miracles. After all, if God created everything out of nothing, it would hardly be a problem for Him to rearrange parts of that creation as He and when He wishes. It would not be a problem for Him to supernaturally cause a man to walk on water. To be sure that miracles cannot occur, you would have to be sure beyond a doubt that God did not exist. Of course, that itself would be an article of faith, for the existence of God can be neither demonstrably, empirically proven or disproven. Now, having said the above, I don't want to be hard on people who struggle with the idea of God's intervention in the natural order. Miracles are hard to believe in, and they should be. Allow me to take off on a little tangent, if you don't mind. Let's go to Matthew chapter 28. Now, the context of the verse that I want us to look at is that Jesus has been crucified, Jesus has been raised, and He's talking with His disciples before His ascension back to heaven. We find this remarkable passage in Matthew chapter 28, and I want to begin at verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw Him, they worshiped Him, but some doubted. Did you catch that? When the 11, those who had been with Jesus from the very beginning of His ministry, those who had been with Him for 3+ years, those who were closer to Him than any others, when they saw Him, they worshiped Him, but some doubted. Some doubted. This is a remarkable admission, don't you think? Our author is telling us that some of the founders of Christianity couldn't believe the miracle of the resurrection even when they were looking straight at Jesus with their eyes and touching Him with their hands. There is no other reason for this to be in the account unless it really happened. The apostles responded like any group of modern people. Some believed with their eyes what their eyes were telling them, and some didn't. But this text also shows us the purpose of miracles. They lead not simply to cognitive belief, but to worship, to awe, to wonder. The miracles were never designed to impress or coerce. They were designed to leave us in awe of God and in awe of His involvement in the natural world. And what should be our response to Him and these miracles? Worship. Well, that explanation of how science does not disprove the possibility of miracles was probably longer than you wanted or longer than I expected. But the short of it is that yes, we can believe in miracles. We can believe Jesus walked on water. We can believe in God's supernatural activity in our natural world. Now, let's hurry on to application before the sands in my hourglass run out. How might we make application of this sign to our lives? First, I would say, this sign and this text shows us that Jesus is someone who is able to help us in our distress. He is able to help us in times of distress. In this sign, Jesus shows Himself to be master of the natural forces of wind and wave, and the Lord of gravity and its power. I'm wondering if we should read this sign in the light of a certain psalm in the Old Testament, Psalm number 77. One commentator, I can't remember who it was, thinks that John's original readers may have had Psalm 77 in mind when they read this particular passage from John chapter 6. So I want to read parts of Psalm 77. You might even want to go there in your own Bible. Back here in the Old Testament, before the book of Isaiah, I should have marked this in my Bible before I sat in front of this camera. Okay, Psalm 77. See if this doesn't sound to you as if Jesus and John may have this text in mind, the walking on water. I'm going to start reading in Psalm 77 and verse 1. I cry aloud to God that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God, and I moan. I meditate, and my spirit faints. Does that not sound like a person who is in deep and dire distress? And he wants to think about God, and he wants God to come to his rescue, but he is so burdened down that he's not sure it will happen. Let's go on to verse 11 in this passage, where the psalmist expresses a little bit more faith. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. You see what he's saying now. He's in distress, he's in trouble, but he's going to force himself to remember what God has done. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. I wonder what wonderful deeds the psalmist has in mind as he thinks about what God has done. Perhaps he's thinking about the Exodus as Israel left Egypt and went eventually to the Promised Land and had to journey through the wilderness. And I'm wondering if the psalmist is thinking about their deliverance from the Red Sea and their deliverance from Pharaoh and their sustenance as God sustained them through the wilderness. Anyway, the psalmist in dire distress forces himself to contemplate what God has done in the past. And finally, let's go to verse 16 and see if this doesn't specifically sound like what happens in John chapter 6. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies thundered, your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Now note verse 19. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Perhaps John has Psalm 77 in mind as he writes these words, Jesus walking on the sea. Yes, Jesus is here portrayed as the master of nature, making wind and water do his bidding. And when the 12 were in distress, Jesus appeared. He calmed the storm and he stilled their fears. Just as Jesus helped the 12 in their distress, he can do the same for us. In our distress, we can turn to him. We can turn to God. But I think we also learn something else about Jesus in this text, and something that we can apply to our own lives. It is that Jesus is also someone who is willing to help us in our distress. For in our story, Jesus demonstrated his concern for his own when the winds were contrary and when they were alone. Hey, he does the same for his children today. He would have us know that he is present in our time of need. I've said this before, so if you've heard it, please act as if you haven't. There are times when people who are able to help us can't help us, won't help us, because they're unwilling to help us. And there are some people who are willing to help us, but they're just not able. They don't have the resources at their command to rescue or deliver us or help us in time of need. But this is one thing I appreciate so much about Jesus. He is both willing and able to help us in our distress. So, my friend, whatever hardship, trial, or trouble you may be facing just now, I want you to know that you can turn to Jesus. You can turn to God. Are you facing some financial collapse? How about the deterioration of your own health? Or the loss of a spouse? Or the loss of a child? Are you facing the prospect of your own death? Well, the good news here is that you can turn to Jesus at such a time. And you might say, well, what can He do? Well, at the very least, He can and will come alongside you and be with you through the distress. At the very least, He can come alongside and say, do not be afraid, it is I. And why can you believe that He is willing and able to do this? Because one time, a long time ago, Jesus saw from a great distance His closest friends in distress. They were in desperate need, and He saw it, and He did something about it. He went to them walking on the sea, and He calmed their hearts. Turn to Jesus, my friend. He will not disappoint you.